This morning, again, we're going to step into a story, and it's going to sound a little bit like strange, like superhero-ish, almost oriented. But again, this is Matthew's experience. This is what he's seeing and experiencing. He's writing it down so that we can, hear what he's claiming he experiences of Jesus. And it forces us again to consider, who is this person? Who is this Jesus? And the first thing he's going to give us is a taste of three different things. And these are things that people, I think, long for, and I think have also experienced at other points in time throughout the story of the Bible, if you're familiar with other places in the Bible this morning. And I don't know how you perceive a taste, but this is what I think of. I think of a story, well, a couple of things. One, when I was a kid, my mom brought me into her baking experience. She took a cake decorating class when I was 2 or 3 years old, and she would set me down in the lobby while she went to this class, and I would color in coloring books and stuff like that, and she learned how to decorate cakes well. And so from that point on in my childhood experience, we would bake a lot of cakes and brownies and things. And I always loved the process because my mom would involve me, and I didn't have very many siblings at that point because I was the first child. And so I would get to lick the spoon or the beaters or whatever from all this delicious mix. I don't know if I got salmonella or if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Don't know how that worked out, but it tasted great. And I loved it because it was a wonderful taste. But I also knew that there was more to come. There's this whole cake or batch of brownies that I get to experience later. Similarly, if you walk through Costco the week of Super Bowl, they're going to hand you out all these samples. And if you purchase some of the things that you sample, you realize, I had this sample, it was great, but I have a whole box of these that I'm going to bake or cook or fry up in a few more days. And so there's so much more beyond just this taste. And I think Matthew is saying Jesus is giving or gave some of his followers a taste of something, but there's so much more that's to come in the story. So I want us to pick up, again, it's Matthew 17, and I put the verses here on the screen if you'd like that for ease. If you have a Bible and you prefer to read that way or on your phone, that's great as well. And this is how the Christian Standard Bible, that version starts. It says, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and his brother John and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. So just a little context. Peter, James, and John are some of Jesus' closest friends. They're part of that inner core of 12 people that Jesus is training up. They're his students. They want to imitate the way that Jesus does life. And so he takes this kind of close core 3 people, takes them up, he takes them on a high mountain. And it sounds like, well, great, they went for a hike from our point of view. But there are some things where these terms and these descriptions have come up in the Bible different places before. And so we need to make some connections here that don't just automatically connect for a lot of us. The first is after 6 days. There's something in the very beginning of the Bible that's described as happening, in the course of 6 days. 6 days, that period of time is used to describe it. And that's God's creation. And the 7th day is supposed to be this day where God takes a break and rests. And that 7-day pattern, which we call a week, which we incorporate even in our culture and our society today, becomes like the basis for the Jewish life. And so after 6 days, you look forward to a restful day, and a day when a lot of Jews even still believe that that's when they go to encounter God. And so it's this 7th day. It's also the day when you find in the stories in Genesis 1 and 2, this man and woman that God makes, he puts them in a garden. He makes everyone in the course of 6 days, however you define that. But on the 7th day, they're placed in this wonderful garden, and they have closeness with God. So that's key. Also, there's 3 people that are going with Jesus. And the term 3 in the Bible comes up a lot. And it a lot of times is a clue that something significant is about to take place. So if you see a group of 3 people or you see the number 3, look out because something's coming. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but it's important. Third thing, they're going up. And also in the Old Testament, especially of the Bible, anytime people go up, it's normally good. And anytime people go down, it's normally bad. So if you read up, you can think, oh, this is a good thing coming. And if you read about people going down, you realize hardship or disaster or trouble is happening. So this is a good thing. They're going up to a good place and a good experience. And they're also going to a high mountain. And that term isn't used very often in the New Testament. There's mountains or hills all over the place. It's the same word, but high mountain is like someplace special. And it's meant to connect our minds with other things that took place on high mountains. Do you know the Garden of Eden is actually described in the beginning of the Bible as being set on a mountain? Because these rivers come out of it and they flow out into the land and the rest of that part of the ancient world from that mountaintop place. A mountaintop is a place that's connected with meeting with God and closeness with God. It's the place where heaven and earth kind of touch, right? Symbolically. And even more than that, because when you read about this Exodus story in Exodus in the New Testament, where Moses is appointed by God to deliver the nation of Israel away from slavery in Egypt, one of the places that Moses meets with God is on a very high mountain. And so it's supposed to activate all those ideas. This is a place, essentially, that's paradise. It's something that happens on the seventh day, like where Eden is introduced. It's something where there's three people. It's significant. It's something that happens in a good place where heaven and earth meet, where you come to experience some blessing from God. So this is like a mountaintop experience. This is a little paradise here. And even the temple in Jerusalem is depicted as sort of this little paradise where you encounter God. God comes to this mountain, and his presence is over this place. And so they're about to walk with God. That's the image that we get. Whatever's going to happen, it's going to be good. And these three friends of Jesus are about to have this mountaintop experience where they walk with God. They're going to be experiencing a little bit of paradise, a little bit of delight. That's what Eden means, by the way, is delight or paradise. So they're going to have a little piece of paradise on earth. And maybe this is a point for us to think about at this point. What is paradise? I always picture it as a tropical beach somewhere because I'm a warm person. I like to be warm. I like the ocean. I like my sand in the feet, or feet in the sand, sorry. I guess I get sand on my feet too, but that's what I like, and I think of that as paradise. But if we're thinking about paradise in terms of a place and a close connection with God, what does that start to bring up in our minds? What is that like? What was Eden like? What is this experience going to be like? And if it's a taste, what does God have ahead for us in the future? Maybe we have a piece of paradise to look forward to as well. And maybe it's a place where we come to be close with God. Maybe it's a place that we can experience through a relationship with God here on earth as we walk about. Maybe that's, for those of you who are a little more familiar with the New Testament and the Christian experience, what the Holy Spirit would be considered, who's placed inside of us. Maybe we can have one of these close encounter, mountaintop experiences with God wherever we go, whenever we pray, whenever we want. And maybe it's something future. Maybe that's why Jesus turned to a criminal who was being crucified next to him on the cross when he was put to death and said, after that criminal confessed, I think you're this Messiah, you're this promised Savior, King figure that Israel's been looking forward to for generations. He said, you'll walk with me in paradise today. We'll be together in Eden, so to speak, today. Something that we have perhaps to look forward to as well. And now something interesting happens. Something kind of crazy happens. In verse 2, it says, Jesus was transfigured before them, in front of them. We get the word metamorphosis from that same term. You think of a butterfly, it goes into its chrysalis, right? And it comes out. A couple weeks later, it's got wings. It was this caterpillar, and now it has wings and antennae and all kinds of things that it didn't used to have previously. So it switches forms. And Jesus is switching forms on this mountain in front of him. And it says his face shone like the sun. His clothes became bright white as the shining light. So if you're buying into what Matthew is saying, this is kind of a freaky experience where a normal human, walks up on the mountain with them, but all of a sudden his face and his skin start emitting light, radiating light. And I think one of the reasons why Matthew includes this is because of who he thinks Jesus is. He thinks that Jesus is greater than just a human. It even thinks Jesus is greater than a character named Moses in the Old Testament. Moses had a unique experience with God where he went up onto a mountain and God spoke with him for 40 days. And when he came down, something unique was happening to his skin. It was shining. And it became so distracting to the rest of the people that he had to cover his face often, or that would be all they would ever talk about, was, oh, Moses is glowing down here. But it says Moses started glowing because he was exposed to God's presence. And Jesus hasn't been exposed visibly to some divine presence. He just starts shining out of himself. And so we're supposed to connect. This is something that's even greater than the experience that Moses had, because Moses had to be in the presence of God for this to happen. And Jesus just starts doing it. So who is Jesus? Is Jesus emitting light because Jesus is the very presence of God? That's kind of what Matthew, I think, is leading us to think about. He's radiating light. And this is interestingly how we see God in the beginning of the Bible and in the end of the Bible. In the beginning, he says, let there be light, before he makes the sun, the moon, any of those light-giving things. He is the light. And at the very end, it talks about how God and the Lamb, which is a term to refer to Jesus as a sacrificial lamb, they are the light of this eternal city that appears at the end, very end of the Bible. And so who is this Jesus if he just starts shining light out from nowhere? And how is that a taste of something? Maybe this is a Jesus that we get to encounter someday as well. And I think this is something that Peter and James and John and perhaps we as well will encounter someday. Later on, when John is old, he sees a vision where he sees Jesus in heaven. But this Jesus is very different than the Jesus he knew on earth. This Jesus is shining and his hair is bright white and his clothes are brilliant. It's the Jesus he saw on this mountaintop experience, not the Jesus he walked and talked with among the people every single day. Maybe this is the Jesus that we will encounter someday eternally as well. But I also think this is a taste of a transformation that we, as followers of Jesus ourselves, may one day undergo in a couple ways. In 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul talks about other people who are followers of Jesus in this way. He says, we all, with unveiled faces, are looking as in a mirror at the glory of the Lord, Jesus, and are being transformed into that same image from glory to glory. This is from the Lord who is the Spirit. And so Paul says in one way, we start to look a little bit more like Jesus as we get to know him better, as we start to follow him and live the way that he lives on earth. And so we start to reflect some of that brightness, not a physical brightness, but more of an emotional and a social brightness. God's love starts to pour out of us. So there's that aspect. But there's also something else Jesus said earlier in Matthew. Matthew records him saying something. And what he said at that point was that one day the righteous, those who are right with God and right with each other, will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. And so maybe there's even a case made for some eternal condition where we glow, we shine, just like Jesus is visibly shining here. I don't know. Something different is happening. And not only that, it says in verse 3, suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Now, if you know anything about contemporaries, right? Contemporaries are people that live at the same time on earth, right? Now, Jesus is walking, around maybe 30 AD at this point in time. Do you know when Moses was walking on the face of the earth? Probably 1400s BC. So this is a person who is alive and who clearly, according to the Bible story, died 1400 years ago. But he's not dead. He's on top of a mountain walking around with Jesus. And also Elijah. And Elijah lived 900 years previously. Elijah has an interesting story because supposedly, according to another prophet named Elisha, Elijah was walking and he had been tortured and tormented and chased down, hunted down by a wicked king and queen. Sounds like a Disney story, right? Ahab and Jezebel. And he had been depressed, he had been fleeing, he had been seeking refuge. And at one point in time, God just said, this is enough. You can come up with me. And according to Elisha, he said he saw a chariot of fire come down from the clouds out of the sky, out of heaven, and pick up Elijah and just take him up in a tornado. And he disappeared. So again, you take it for what you believe it to be, what it's worth. But this is what Elisha says he saw. And so it's possible, if you believe him, that this man never experienced death. But he was ushered out of this world 900 years previously. So what in the world are these people doing? First conclusion is maybe this is just a dream, this is a vision, this is not reality. But Luke, when he's sharing the same story, he talks about how in the middle of this, Peter, James, and John, they've actually fallen asleep somehow before the glowing starts happening and before these other two individuals who died hundreds of years ago or left the earth hundreds of years ago appear. They fell asleep on the mountain with Jesus. Jesus was praying and they fell asleep. Have you heard that before? Right? They did it in the garden as well. And they wake up. So they're awake, and then they see Jesus shining, and then they see these other two people talking with Jesus, who are Moses and Elijah. And so it's not a dream. It's not some vision or altered state of consciousness. They're actually seeing this happen in front of them. And I think that echoes back to something Jesus says as Mark records it in Mark's gospel. He's having a conversation with a group of Jewish religious leaders who don't believe that there's resurrection. There's nothing after life on earth. People don't come back from the dead. Nothing like that happens. And he says, haven't you read in Moses' book, in the passage about the burning bush, how God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. And these are people that lived 600 years before Moses' time, or 600 to 400 years before Moses' time. And Jesus says, he's not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living. And so I think what we're getting a taste of here with this story is a little bit of permanence. We've seen God's presence, perhaps, in Jesus' bright, shining, light-emitting skin and face. And we've seen a little piece of paradise where this is happening in their encounter with God that's about to happen. But now we're getting a little taste of the permanence of life. Moses and Elijah, who left centuries ago, now they're arriving. And Luke also says they're in glory. They're shining to some degree as well. They've been exposed to God's presence. And they talk with Jesus. And they do it not because they're dead, but because they're still alive. Because living people talk with people. Dead people don't, right? That's how we envision it. But this story, Matthew's making the claim that these individuals, they didn't really die. They changed destinations after life on earth. They went somewhere, but a part of them, the part of them that's really them, is still alive and just showed up on this mountaintop and is now having a conversation with Jesus. And I think this brings up some interesting questions about life after death as we consider that. What is death like? If these two, at least Moses, experienced death, and 1,400 years later, he shows up and he's talking with Jesus on a mountain, and 3 other humans clearly see and hear this thing happening, then what is death like? Are we just gone forever? Are we still conscious? Can we talk? Can we interact with other people who have died? Are we invisible? Are we more magnificent than we used to be? Are we aware of what's happening on earth? I think this story brings up all those questions and might give us a little bit of a hint of an answer at those things. So it's an interesting thing to ponder. And maybe we get a little window in, at least from Matthew's perspective on that. The other thing I often wonder about is, what were they talking about, right? They show up and they're talking with Jesus on this mountain, and these 3 students of Jesus are kind of blown away by the whole experience, but they all talk about how, they're having a conversation. So what's the conversation about? Matthew doesn't say. Isn't that great? He just leaves it open. Thankfully, some other people did some digging who wrote other accounts of Jesus' life, namely Luke, and he asks a lot of questions, and he records what they were talking about. What they were talking about is Jesus' departure. And it's interesting because the word that's used when Matthew originally writes this, or it's recorded in the Greek language of the time, it's the word Exodus. Have you heard the word Exodus somewhere before? Right? In the Old Testament, it's the Greek name that's given to the Greek translation of the second book in the Old Testament, which is where our English Bible gets that word Exodus from. And it means the road out. So they're talking about the road out. And it's interesting because Moses had a crazy road out of Egypt, where God sent these plagues, these miraculous happenings to convince the Pharaoh at the time that he wanted to let all of his slave labor just wander off into the wilderness. Finally, he's convinced because God keeps turning the pressure up on him, and he lets Moses and the people go, and they're delivered. And then they get to a sea, and they can't cross it. And the Pharaoh gets upset, so he sends an army out after Moses and the Hebrew people as they're escaping from Egypt. And so they've got their back against the sea, and they've got an army at their front. And God supernaturally steps in the way overnight and parts the sea and stands between the Egyptian army and the Israelite people, and they walk through. So in the face of certain death, they have a road out. And a similar experience happens for Elijah. He is faced with certain death. He has a king and a queen and all of the military power that they have available hunting him down, trying to take his life. And then God sends a chariot of fire down from heaven to give him a road out. And so now Jesus is about to have a road out. We think, well, this is awesome. Like Moses' road out was great. Elijah's road out was great. But those roads were backed up against death before they opened up. But unlike Moses and unlike Elijah, Jesus' road out isn't going to open up right before death, in the face of death. It's actually going to be going through death himself. That's going to be the road out. And that's going to really be confusing for Jesus' friends and his followers and his students to wrap their mind around, because they think of death as like a finality and an end. But for Jesus, This is his road out. This is his way of providing deliverance or freedom or liberation. It's not from death, it's through death. That's going to be a confusing point. But I think that's why these people probably show up on the mountain, because they can all talk in some way about this exodus, this road out experience. They've all experienced it, and Jesus is about to experience it as well. And maybe that's why God sent them at this point, to have that conversation with Jesus and to be an encouragement. And I think the reason why we get those little tastes is because there's a few tests that are being set up here. Tests for Jesus' followers, for Peter, James, and John, and maybe tests for us as well that apply today. Verse 4 kind of gives me that idea. It says, then Peter said to Jesus, so Peter's taking it all in, and he goes, it's good for us to be here. This is great. I don't know why, but this has got to be good. And then he says, if you want, I'll set up 3 shelters, 3 like temporary tents in the wilderness. One for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And it seems to come out of nowhere. We think, why in the world? Like, you're seeing all this crazy supernatural stuff happen in front of you on a mountain. Why are you going to offer to build these people tents? This seems so strange. And it seems so strange to me. And I can't give you a definitive answer because Matthew doesn't record it. But I'll give you my thoughts as to the reason behind that. I think this is a test to see, one, if Peter, James, and John are going to actually be clued in and have an awareness of what's about to happen. Jesus has already mentioned that he's going to be killed. And yet his followers they think this is symbolic. They don't really think it's going to happen. It's not really real. They don't know what Jesus is really saying. They're not taking him literally at all. And I think at this point, Peter, he is just not quite aware of what Jesus is saying. I think he still sees this victory and this road out for Jesus as something that's a political victory that's going to happen here on earth. I think he's making some connections. Yeah, what's happening here is kind of like this mountaintop experience with Moses, and it's kind of like the exodus that our people experienced 1,400 years earlier through the wilderness out of Egypt. It's a similar thing. We're going to have deliverance, and Jesus is going to be the deliverer, which are true. But Peter's thinking, at this point in time, I think, you know what? Jesus is going to deliver us. He's going to deliver our nation, and he's going to establish his physical kingdom on earth, which the Old Testament predicted at some point in time would happen. And I think Peter is saying, I can't imagine more of a dream team than this. This is like having Superman and Aquaman and Thor in one place at one point in time. I mean, Elijah, he called down fire from heaven on these prophets for a false worship system. And Moses, he parted a sea. And Jesus, he's been doing miracle after miracle after miracle, and now his face is shining. Like, look out, Rome. And I think he's thinking, Jesus and Moses and Elijah are going to spend a little time in the wilderness walking around like Moses and the people did, but then they're going to come into the promised land and they're going to conquer and they're going to crush some people. So maybe they're going to hang out here for a while before they come and conquer. So maybe we should build some shelters because it'd be kind of awkward if you were out in the wilderness and didn't have any place to stay. And I literally think that's what's going through Peter's mind at this point in time. Like, victory's on the horizon, so you superheroes probably need some shelter for a few nights, so let me build it for you right here. I don't think he's aware. I don't think he passes this test of awareness. I don't think he understands that Jesus is about to deliver them spiritually from something that's hindered humanity ever since the beginning, something that will repair their broken relationship with God, their selfishness that's become a very part of our being and a core of who we are. I don't think they see that deliverance. I think he's still looking for a political deliverance at this point in time. He hasn't quite clued in. Even after they walk down from the mountain at the end of the story, Jesus talks about rising from the dead, and they talk to each other and say, what does that mean? They think it's symbolic or something else. I don't think they're aware. Verse 5, it says, while he was still speaking, and there's just like more crazy stuff that keeps happening in this story. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud covered them. And a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And this is not an easy experience to go through. It says when these disciples, these 3 guys, heard this, they fell on their face and they were terrified. This is scary. This is a bright, glowing cloud that presses over them, and this maybe booming voice says, this is my son. I'm pleased in him. Listen to him. And they just, like whatever the situation is, they just fall on their faces, terrified. It says Jesus came up and he touched them and said, "Get up, don't be afraid." And they look up and it's just Jesus there. And he looks normal and no one's there and there's no cloud anymore. We think, well, what is happening here? I think there's a couple things. This is supposed to draw our attention back again with the terms that are used, the bright cloud that covers over the mountain, the voice from the cloud. This is exactly how God relates with Israel after they come out of Egypt. They move to a mountain, Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb in some accounts, and they're gathered around the mountain, and this cloud of fire and smoke descends on the mountain, and there's this voice that's coming from it, and thunder and lightning, and God's presence is over the mountain. And this is taking us to that place again. It's transporting us back in time to Exodus. It's also transporting us to what the Father said at Jesus' baptism. "This is my beloved Son. I'm pleased in him. Listen to him." Listen to him is actually key as well, because in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses predicted a day when God would one day raise up a prophet like him from among his own brothers, from among the Jews. And he said, you must listen to him. And so we're getting testimony from the voice of God saying, this is that prophet who is raised up. This is that deliverer like Moses. Pay attention to him. Pay attention. Step into what he's calling you into. I want to take us back to the book of Exodus, to this experience that Israel had near this mountain, and kind of make an application from this for us. This is Exodus 19 and Exodus chapter 20 as well. It says, Moses went up to the mountain of God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. So he's voice from the mountain again. This is what you must say to the house of Jacob and explain to the Israelites. So he says, Moses, tell Israel this. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you'll carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, my agreement, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine. And you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. It's interesting that God would say, you'll be my kingdom of priests, because we know that Israel was a kingdom with priests, but they certainly weren't a kingdom of priests where every man, woman, and child was a priest, right? But this is what God intends. He says, these are the words that you're going to say to the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud. Here's this dense cloud that's also happening in the New Testament here in the story. So the people will hear when I speak with you and will always believe you. Maybe that's the same reason that God's voice is speaking to Peter, James, and John. So they'll hear. So they'll always believe in who Jesus is. Moses reported to the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord told Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. So get them ready for this experience. They have to wash their clothes and be prepared by the third day. There's 3 again, so something significant is about to happen. For on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. So God's going to come down onto it. So get ready. You've got 3 days to prepare yourselves. He says, put boundaries for the people all around the mountain and say, be careful that you don't go up onto the mountain or touch its base. Anyone who touches the mountain must be put to death. And this is for this time of preparation. Before you're adequately prepared, don't go on the mountain, don't touch it or you'll die. No hand may touch him. Instead, he'll be stoned or shot with arrows and not live, whether animal or human. So, don't go on the mountain early. But, he says, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, after 3 days, they may go up on the mountain. So don't touch it ahead of time. But when the ram's horn sounds, all the people can go up on the mountain and experience the presence of God. On the third day, when the morning came, there was thunder and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain. So people are afraid, right? And a very loud blast from the ram's horn, the trumpet. So all the people in the camp, they shuddered. So here's this horn, and it's time to go up on the mountain, and everyone's afraid. It says, then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. So they're going up to meet God, and they're right at the foot of the mountain, but it's terrifying. It was completely enveloped in smoke, it says, because the Lord came down on it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. This is like you're going to walk into a volcano to meet with God, like an erupting volcano, and you're supposed to walk up into that to meet with God. And it says in verse 19, the sound of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, like it's still blowing because nobody's doing anything. They're all standing at the base of the mountain. God wants them to go up on it, but they didn't do anything because they're afraid. And so eventually Moses, he walks up through the smoke and the fire cloud and just, it's gone. But everybody else just stays down at the base. What a cool invitation. What a missed one. Chapter 20 flashes back to this moment and it gives a little more detail. This is in Exodus. All the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning and the sound of the ram's horn in the mountain surrounded by smoke. When the people saw it, they trembled and they stood at a distance. And they said, "You speak to us, Moses, and we'll listen, but don't let God speak to us or we'll die." So we don't want to go up into that. We're content with you talking to us. We don't want God to talk with us. And so Moses said, don't be afraid. God's come to test you so you'll fear him and so you won't sin. This is a test. The fire, all the smoke, all the terrifying things, go through it. Like God wants to talk with you. This is a test. And the people remained standing at a distance as Moses approached the total darkness where God was. They say, we don't want to pass this test. No, thank you. Moses, you be a representative. And I think this is a similar test for Peter and James and John, a test of action. Will they listen to Jesus and take advantage of the opportunities that God is about to give them to know Jesus, to know God more, to carry out Jesus' will and his mission on earth? Are they going to step into that, or is it going to be terrifying, and are they going to just stay back and never commit? Kind of like Israel did. We don't know what Israel missed out on. God had told them, I want to make you a kingdom of priests, and we know that that sure didn't happen. They had some priests, but not everybody had that access to God. And now Jesus is about to come to offer another opportunity for people to have this access with God that Israel walked away from. So Peter, James, and John, what are you going to do? An extension to us, what are we going to do with that? We're going to take this invitation, we're going to just stay back. Verse 9, it says, as they were coming down the mountain, down is it good or bad? Down is bad. Something bad's going to happen, right? When Moses came down the mountain, in one of the stories in Exodus, he found the people had suddenly decided to make this golden image of a calf and start worshiping this idol. Got the idea from Egypt, probably, just make all these images of animals and start to treat them like gods. So that's what Moses walked down into, some rebellion. And maybe when they walk down the mountain, Jesus and his disciples are going to face some resistance and some oppression and some rebellion in the future days. We know that's coming next because Jesus has already mentioned his death a couple of times. People are going to lack faith who Jesus is going to walk into. Jesus commands them, don't tell anyone about the vision, that thing you saw, until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. Why do you think he said that? Again, I can't offer you a definitive answer. But one of the things that comes to my mind is, if you tell people Moses appeared on the mountain, if you tell people Elijah appeared on the mountain, there's some familiarity with that happening in the future in the Old Testament. In the book of Malachi, the prophet Malachi told Israel, there's a day coming when God's judgment is going to fall upon the earth. He calls it the day of the Lord, a terrible day of the Lord. And before that happens, and ultimately Israel has a victory from its oppressors and its enemies, Elijah's going to show up. And I think if his disciples went down the mountain and started spreading the word, we saw Elijah. He's here. He showed up. He's here. I tried to build a tent for him. Jesus wouldn't let me. He's here. Everyone would realize, and they would think, these guys are going to team up. The dream team is here. They're going to take out Rome with fire and floods and everything and who knows what. And we're free. Like Israel is going to rule the world. It's happening now. But that wasn't the kind of deliverance that Jesus had in mind. Something totally different. And Jesus' disciples follow up. They say, well, why do the scribes, the people who spend their lifetime looking at the Hebrew Bible, why do they say Elijah must come first? Jesus says Elijah is coming and will restore everything. So there is a point in time when this will take place, but it's not right now. And he says, here's some food for thought. It's my paraphrase. If you want to consider it, Elijah already has come. And they realized Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. And so from the scribes' perspective, these are people that immerse themselves in the Bible. They copy it day after day after day after day. It's their job, right? If you copy one book for your job for a lifetime, you're going to be pretty familiar with that, right? These are the experts. And the experts say, When Elijah shows up, the very next thing that's happening is like a terrible day when the Lord is going to work out his judgment and Israel is going to rise as the preeminent nation in the world and all of Israel's enemies are going to go away and be conquered. That's what's happening next. The most expert opinion on that was this is the next thing that's happening. And Jesus says, well, actually, from God's point of view, there are kind of 3 times when Elijah shows up. I know that prophet Malachi talked about a coming of Elijah, but really in God's plan, Elijah showed up symbolically in John the Baptist. And Elijah just showed up on this mountain with me. You just saw him. And there's still going to come a time down the road when Elijah is going to come again before this conquering judgment time that God's predicted. So it's really happening in 3 different phases. And yet the most expert minds would have never concluded that. I think maybe that's a final test for them and a final test for us, and that is assumption. Even today, we have people who confidently say, this is what's going to happen. Even future events concerning the Bible, or maybe politically in our country or other nations, people are saying, we know this is exactly what's ahead. And I think we have to be careful with that, because even the most expert opinions and the people who are most well-versed and well-studied may be missing out on certain aspects of what God has in mind. And so I think it's wise for us to be careful about the assumptions that we make. Sure, we can hear people's ideas, but I think we need to let Jesus' words, the things that he says, or even the things he doesn't say, his silence on certain issues, sometimes inform the claims that people make, or even limit the claims that people make, because there's a lot of things that we just don't completely know. And I wonder if we're going to go boldly beyond the things that are written to some degree. So should you listen to other people's thoughts or ideas or interpretations of Scripture? Of course. Should you buy into everything a certain teacher tells you about things that are yet to come? Possibly not. Maybe there's some things that God has in store that we haven't figured out yet. I think it's good for us to have a dose of humility before we make, again, bold assumptions that we know how everything plays out. So there's a lot of different things here, but it surrounds 3 tastes of what Matthew believes is to come for the followers of Jesus, and also some different kinds of tests that God throws our way to show us who we are or to just remind us of our limitations sometimes. So what do we do with this? I don't know what you'll do with it. Here's a few thoughts. Maybe you think about this concept of Eden and a place where you go meet with God, be with God, experience God. How do you think you can experience God or maybe exemplify heaven on earth? Got any thoughts toward that? Maybe that's a way that you direct your thoughts. What's one area of my life that needs to change forms to more closely resemble Jesus? You probably can't make your skin start glowing, but maybe there's something about Jesus' life that inspires you and you think, I could make a transformation. I could have a metamorphosis of my own to more closely resemble something. Thirdly, how should I reimagine death in light of the appearances of Moses and Elijah? Maybe we get ideas about death. Death is it. Lights out, gone. You can still hold that belief, but if this is really true, what happened and Matthew saw it and records it, maybe there's some more things to think about. Fourthly, how am I responding to these 3 different tests that we talked about today? I put that on the back of the bulletin if you want to read those or go back online when our service is posted. But am I aware that Jesus' death was necessary for my freedom? Am I aware of that? Am I listening to Jesus and acting on what he says, or am I just kind of standing back saying, I don't know that I want that? I want to have a go-between. I'm going to go hear a sermon. I'll hear somebody else say what Jesus is saying, but I don't really want to investigate myself. Or am I assuming that myself or all my religious teachers have all the right answers about everything? Maybe not even future things, just about God. God's broad, God's big. Somebody might be well-studied and they might be right 98% of the time, but do they really have all the things figured out? We probably should go to Jesus' words and keep examining that and have a little dose of humility in that. So all those things are things to consider.